Alright, well good morning. Thanks guys for logging in. And today we're going to be talking about some of the things that have come up in 2015 for what's new. My name is Jesse Sprague. I'll be going over some of these things with you. And today's going to be kind of a fun one because I get to kind of control the show. I guess I'm always in control, but these ones are ones that I've kind of handpicked, I guess, out of what's a massive list. I guess every year a massive list of what's new. This one I've kind of pared down. Obviously we only have a short time together this morning, so I've picked out kind of my favorites, some of the things that have come along, things that now that we've been using 2015, many of us for a while anyway, things that I've found that I've really liked, and things that have kind of stuck with me. So I've got a list of things that we can check out this morning, and again, many things that we've seen before, but through the rollout events, but some of the ones that have really stuck with me that have been my favorites. So without too much blabber, let's get into what I've picked out for us this morning. So we'll take a fairly similar approach as we often do through many of these. We'll take a look at some of my interface favorites and sketch tools, parts and features, assemblies, some of the drawing enhancements, and see which ones that, like I've mentioned, have kind of stuck with me. The first one that I want to talk about with SOLIDWORKS 2015 is the hidden component preview, and that is I think a small enhancement, but definitely a nice one when you've got large assemblies. And I don't have an example of a huge assembly here to look at, but this is a model that we've seen before in the What's New files. And one of the enhancements that they added this year was the ability to get a preview of what the component is going to look like, or what that component is in the assembly, independent of having it actually being shown. So if I hide this component, we see that component disappears. And if I have a lot of hidden components, which happens sometimes, especially in large assemblies, sometimes it's tough to figure out which components are which. Now, fortunately for us in this case, this component has a name that makes sense to what it is. But even so, when I click on it, we get a preview, a visual preview of what that component is, so that we know, yes, that's the one that I want to work with, or that's the one that I want to turn back on. Now, many times what is the case is that we've got something more like this, where we have just a number, just a part number or something like that. And this can get confusing. I mean, even if this is our own assembly, this can get confusing, but very much so for people who are less familiar. If you hire in somebody new, or are working with somebody that you've just sent this assembly to, that's not familiar with your structure, this can be very confusing. I don't know what a 62197 is, but if I select it and it shows up in the preview as a preview, then that helps me out a lot in just searching through the assembly. So that's one of my favorite visual enhancements that they've added this year. One of the other things that I really like, that's kind of across the board, doesn't have specifically to do with assemblies, has to do with selection. There's a couple of selection additions that they made for 2015 that I really like. Selection sets kind of carried over from Composer. I really like that functionality. But the one that I want to mention here is this previous selection. And this can really come in handy again when you've got a large assembly. If I hit previous selection, we see that it picks up the last component here. I'm in an assembly, so it picks up the last component. Like I said, that does kind of go across the board, whether parts or whatever you're working on, but it picks up the last piece. This can be very helpful if you've got something selected, or many things selected oftentimes, and you go to click on something else and you miss the control key or something like that, and it deselects all of those things that you've picked up. I know that happens to me fairly frequently, right? You bump your finger off the control key or not pressing down hard enough. Previous selection will pick those things back up for you, and I've had that come in handy several times since loading 2015. And against easy access, right on the right click menu pops up in the in context, and you're able to jump back to what you just had selected a moment ago. Don't forget that in 2015 the in context menu is fully customizable, so you can add items to that. I actually have a CAD Dimensions Tech Tip video coming out fairly soon with regards to customizing this for simulation, so keep an eye out for that. Customizing that, it has been very handy as well. One of the other visual things that they've added this year, well, not added, I guess more modified for this year, is the view selector. And the view selector, if you hit the space bar, will come up unless you have it disabled, which is this little button here. So typically in years past, when we hit the space bar, we see that this would come up, this toolbar would come up. 2014, I think it was, they added the view selector, which will pop up with this cube and gives us the option to kind of visualize what views we're going to be getting. And in 2014, when it was introduced, it would kind of snap back to an ISO view, and that was kind of nice, so you could kind of get an overall view. What they did again for 2015 is rework that a little bit, so you'll see that when I select this, it does zoom out, but it keeps the same orientation that we were already in. They've also added this little preview, so you can see off to the top right hand side there as I'm hovering over this pane. It gives us a preview of what that view is going to be should we select that face. What I really like about the cube that they've changed this year is its ability to move with the assembly or with the part though. And I find myself using this view selector much more than I had in the previous release, just because it's so much more flexible. So I can get at what I want to get at. You could hold Alt and click through previously, and you can still do that, but you have the ability to directly access those faces. So I find this much easier than trying to figure out which was the orientation. You can just visually see what you're looking for, snag the view that you're after, and get there very quickly. So I really like that small change that they made for the view selector cube. Let's skip over to some of the sketch options that they've changed this year, because I think those are some of my favorites. So let's move over. I'm just going to start a new sketch here, just so we can kind of poke around in some of the tools that they've added. So I'll just start a new sketch on our front plane, and I'll draw just a couple of lines for us. One of the first things that I want to mention that they've changed this year is with the dimension tool. They always modify and add capability to the dimension tool, but this year they've added something for measuring angles, which I think is pretty neat. So if I grab my smart dimension tool and we go to measure this angle, once I pick that up, we are able to move this across, and we can get the opposite angles, the complementary, supplementary angles. We can get those out of that. But oftentimes what we really need is a doubled angle dimension. And in order to do that, we would have to put another line down here or something to that effect to get that actual physical angle. And they did change that for 2015. It's kind of a sneaky change that they made this year, because we do have to have a keyboard modifier, again, because we do need access to this angle sometimes. But if we hold our shift key, that modifies the behavior of that. So once we cross over, just like a diameter dimension does now, the double diameter dimension, we now have the ability to do that with angles, and this has been awesome. I've used this several times in setting up angle dimensions. We don't have to draw that other reference anymore. We can just hold shift and get that dimension out of it. I like that they use shift, because that's kind of consistent with the shortcut key for the modifier for the smart dimension tool. So it's just easy to remember that shift is usually your modifier for working with the smart dimension tool. Another thing that they cleaned up with sketching has to do with how sketch entities relate to one another. So for example, if I'm sketching along and I've got a piece that comes over here, and maybe maybe a tangent arc off of that, something like this, and we have a line that comes down. While we're working with these, we do get more opportunities to fix things up as we're going, but one of the things that I really liked how they changed was working with two pieces of sketch entity that are chained together. Now typically if we want to add a relation to these two, we have to control select the two of these, letting SOLIDWORKS know that it's these two sketch entities that I'm trying to work with, I'm trying to add something to. We don't have to do that anymore in 2015, and I think this small little thing has saved a ton of time as I've been working. All we've got to do is click on the seam, and we can add that relationship between the two of them that come together at that point. So SOLIDWORKS knows what two entities are coming together at that seam, and we only have to just select that seam now and have that applied. So I think that's pretty cool. That's how I kind of always hoped that it would work, and now it has been set to handle that. So wherever we're trying to add some relations, if I'm trying to make the two of these, something happen between the two of those, we can do that. So definitely pretty neat functionality that they've added in. Another tool that they've added in for sketching in this year has been one for breaking things up evenly. And they've introduced a new tool. It's not by default on the toolbar, so I like to bring it up. It's a very cool tool, and I've used it several times since it's come out, and that's the segment tool. And a segment tool, what that allows you to do is take an entity and break that up into even little pieces. It does have two modes, so we can kind of modify how that works. We've got the ability to choose how many segments we want, and we also have the ability to change whether it adds in points or whether it just breaks the entities up, similar to using the split tool, but in multiple sections and all evenly spaced. So either of these, depending on what you're after, work great. Franco showed an example in the rollouts of using the sketch point option for dropping in a bunch of holes, using the hole wizard, equally spacing those things on a bolt circle or something like that. That's an awesome application of that. But I've used this several times since it's come out, and definitely on the top of my list. So here you can see that the equally spaced, it just drops those points in. That's the option that I had selected. Now, one of the things that is another kind of sneaky addition that they've made that, to be honest, I forgot about a couple times, and now I've kind of gotten it worked into my workflow, is this. And if we've got a line similar to how we were trying to dimension before, if I'm trying to add an angle dimension to this, I can grab my smart dimension. Now this time I don't have this convenient reference along the bottom, and what's neat is with 2015 we actually don't need it. So if I select the line, immediately what we get is the length, right? So we can get a magnitude or vertical, horizontal dimensions out of this. But if we take a moment here, we can come back and select the endpoint of the line. So I selected the line, now the endpoint of the line, and what happens is it brings up this little set of arrows that's asking us where we want to dimension this angle from. And when I select one of these arrows, it then places that angular dimension. So this has come in really handy, and like I said, it's one of those tools that you don't see, so it's easy to forget. But once I've kind of reminded myself a couple of times to use it, it's definitely saved me a bunch of time in dimensioning those types of things, where again we're saving ourselves from having to create extra reference, much like the way that this reduces time, this does as well. We're not having to create extra reference just for the sake of adding in a dimension. It's just immediately there for us. So definitely a cool option there. One of the other options that I want to talk about in sketching that I've also used several times since 2015 has come up is with the box. The box, we got the centerline box quite some time ago, which is very handy. We kind of shortcut our way into being able to center a box very quickly. And this year they've taken that a step further in that every one of these box selections, we get the option for adding construction lines, right? So we can tweak these now to be able to add them, and we can also say where we want those to come from. So if we have from the corners, we get the diagonals. If we have from the midpoints, it goes from the midpoints of the lines. So if we get something like this, we can still use the center rectangle. And now you can see that when we add this in, instead of going from corner to corner on the diagonals and getting the midpoint, now we get from the midpoints of the lines themselves and line themselves up on the midpoint. So if I move this over here, now we can see that we now have these corners open. If nothing else, we can add fillets in here very easily. We're not breaking any relations or anything like that. We have those kind of set. So that definitely comes in handy, and I've used that several times. Let's drop some dimensions on this. Doesn't really matter what they are. I'm just going to make a cube out of it. That looks pretty good. And the next thing that I want to talk about has to do with fillets. So I really just want an edge that we can take a look at some fillets here. One of the things that they've added with fillets is the ability to create asymmetrical fillets, which I think is really cool. The fillet tool, as I mentioned in the rollouts, this thing just keeps growing and growing every year in capabilities. And we see that now with the standard fillet, we have the option to choose a symmetrical or an asymmetrical fillet. I'll leave it symmetrical here for just a moment so we can take a peek at it. And let's bump this up in size a little bit. All right, so we get, with a symmetrical fillet, we get a nice rounded over corner. So we have one single radius to worry about. Let's take a look straight on here. All right, so we can see that radius. Now, if we switch this over to an asymmetrical fillet, we have the same controls, except that we get two radius values that we can tweak. So with two radius values, we have basically what ends up being an elliptical profile here for our fillet. And we can see that if we manipulate these differently, so I'm shrinking that one back or increasing that one, we can pretty easily get a much more complex shape there by just defining two radius values instead of only one. Now, what I really like about this is we can combine this with the conic fillet as well. And the conic fillet is kind of, conics in general have been kind of continuously added throughout the software. Conic fillets have been there for a little bit now. So we see that now I have my elliptical shape. I can actually, from that elliptical shape, make changes to its shape. So you see the endpoints aren't changing, but we're kind of fine-tuning the shape of this. And that's how I like to think about it. We've kind of set the overall asymmetrical shape of it. We've got the blend that we're looking for. Now with the conic values, we can kind of get that smoothed in or tweaked to a point where we like the shape of it even better. And again, the nice thing with this is we're not having to worry about any of those tangencies inverting or anything like that if we were to cut this out with a spline or something like that. So very easy to use, very robust, and we get a pretty fine amount of control out of it by just supplying a couple of values. And again, I like to just kind of tweak. These are obviously would be used for more free-form kind of shapes, but I like to be able to just kind of view that and tweak these out to the shape that I want, especially if I'm trying to match a sketch or an artist rendition or something like that. So neat control. I think added capabilities for not too much extra work to be able to get those kind of complex shapes out of it. Another thing that we have the ability to do with 2015 is to remove pieces of material. We've always been able to remove pieces of material, I guess, but they've changed the way that they've allowed us to do this a little bit. So if we take and create a sketch on this top face, I'm just going to draw an open profile here. Something, doesn't really matter what it is, something to this effect. We can actually use that as a sketch that we can use for an extruded cut. Now, typically, this would be something, like a thin feature. We're used to seeing these open profiles being used for thin features, but with 2015, we've got a flat face here, and you can see what happens is that it actually picks up a selected contour by closing off the sketch. I didn't close off the sketch here. It's projecting that sketch together and intersecting the edge with my sketch. Now, I left this underdefined, which is terrible practice, but for the sake of example here, we've got this shape, assuming it's the shape that we want, and SOLIDWORKS has done the rest of the work, which makes this really nice for setting up little notches or keyways or things like that, where we don't really need this extra detail. We're just defining extra detail to make SOLIDWORKS happy, and they've kind of removed that necessity so that we can now take out these little chunks of material without having to fully close in our sketches, though fully defining them would be a good idea. All right, so let's hop over to patterns here real quick. And some of the changes that they've made to patterns are absolutely awesome. This here we have a single pattern. We've got a linear pattern that's patterning these holes across this rail. And the pattern does a good job of giving us the geometry that we were looking for, but what happens is if we need to make a change to this, we're somewhat limited in what it can do because the pattern has no idea what its surroundings are doing. So if we go to make a change to this, all right, I need to make this shorter, let's say, my pattern blows up because it's continuing on like it always has, and suddenly it just falls off the cliff at the end here, and these instances fail. Well, in 2015, they gave us a really slick way to work with this. Instead of having the pattern just be completely blind as to what it's doing or what its surroundings are doing, we now have the ability to build that kind of information back in. So if we edit this pattern, as soon as we edit the pattern, we can see that what happened here as it falls off the cliff. It's trying to create all of these other instances, and there's nothing for it to put those instances in. It's just cutting air. All right, and in 2015 they give us the option to leave it that way. We can create patterns just like we always have been, but we also now have the ability to use up to reference. And what up to reference does is that allows us to build in some intelligence into this pattern and tell it, okay, now you're paying attention to your surroundings instead of just going on as you always have. So if I switch this over to up to reference, we can use some kind of reference. If I grabbed a vertex on the end there, and we see immediately once I do that, it continues out until it sees this reference. So up to reference, it patterns until it hits a reference, and it will stop. Now what's cool about this is if I say okay to that, we see that I have in fact fixed the pattern, so that's the first benefit of it. But if we go to make some changes after the fact, now as I'm modifying this length, we see that it's adding and removing, look at that, adding and removing instances as it needs to, because this pattern is now aware of its surroundings. Okay, so this is pretty neat. We have a couple other options as to how we want to define these, and in fact we can actually even give it a distance offset if we want to as well, which is kind of neat. We can even go so far as to build equations in there if we want to. I think in the rollouts I showed something like this where we set an equation in here, so you get those types of things. So that can be really neat in being able to build in additional bits of information, because now we have a pattern that's paying attention to its modeled surroundings, but it's also paying attention to its dimensional surroundings as to where that original seed was placing. Now our end condition is related to that original seed. So we're building a ton of information into this one feature, making it just that much more robust, and in the hopes of it giving us exactly what we want every single time. Now, right now we've got it set to this distance, the set spacing option, which is what we always have really used for linear patterns, because we didn't have an equally spaced option for linear patterns. We would have to do a curve-driven pattern or something to that effect. Now, with the new version of the linear pattern, we have this option for set number of instances, and in effect that does an equal spaced option. So if I set this over to set number of instances, instead of me giving it a specific spacing for every instance to hit, now I'm just telling it, all right, well, between these bounds, I want you to fit this many of them in there. Okay, so I was kind of hoping that they would add a set number of instance count for the linear pattern, but they really kind of expanded on it more than I was expecting. So what happens, as we'll see here, is if we set a select number of instances, say 11, it will keep it at that select number of instances, and now if I make any changes, now we'll see that those will be maintained, and we just get the spacing update. Pretty cool. So that has made a huge difference, I think, personally. As I've been working through patterns, we're just able to build in so much more information into those patterns and really get what we're after every time and make things more robust. Another simple change that they made to creating patterns and modifying patterns in SOLIDWORKS 2015 is this change here. So we've got a a pattern. We've got a couple of patterns in this part. We've got a pattern for the cutouts, a pattern for the teeth. Now what we have realized is we've turned this into a weldment part. We're really looking for a body count for how many carbide teeth that we need to put on this saw blade, and we can do that in SOLIDWORKS very easily to switch back and forth between a body and a feature. But our patterns have never been able to follow us as we do that. So if I go back and I change this tooth here, if I go edit feature and we uncheck merge result, unfortunately what we've come to realize is that it will create it as a separate body, but then the pattern blows up because that feature that we use to create that pattern doesn't exist anymore. There is no such feature because it's been treated as a body. In 2015, they've cleaned this up fairly nicely so that when we go back in, we can just edit this feature like we would if we were going to change anything else, instant count or whatever we were to change, and we can actually just remove that as a feature and change this to a body pattern. So now we can convert back and forth from one type to the other. This is nice because obviously this saves us a little bit of time here and just transitioning from one to the other. We don't have to delete it, replace it, but also for downstream features, we don't have to worry about that feature changing or changing a body name or anything like that. Everything is consistent. It's the same feature that was there. It continues to be there. It's just now providing a different function. So that transition has been made a lot easier, and that's obviously made modeling a lot easier. Let's hop over to some of the assembly changes that they've made for this year, because they've made some awesome assembly changes as well. And if we drop down to one of my examples here, this is one of my favorite examples because this is such a cool kind of flashy option. And this one's obviously one of those things where if you need it, it's awesome. If you don't need it, it doesn't help you too much. But the capability, just knowing that the capability is there is really nice to keep in the back of your mind. So what we're looking at is a new component pattern for assemblies, and that is called the chain component pattern. The chain component pattern has 3 different variations to it. I'll show you them all real quick here. It won't take us too much time. All we need to do is pick a path. So we have this little loop of path here. So I'll just grab my selection manager and we'll pick this SketchUp. All right, we grab that open group and we need to tell it what our pattern component is going to be. So I'll select that component. And now what it's asking for is basically how to reference this to that path. So all we'll have to do is pick up something that is kind of cylindrical here. I'll grab that inside face and that picks up as a reference, and we just need to tell it what's the orientation of this component as it travels or as it's attached to this path. So I have a plane in here that gives me that reference, so we can see that kind of shoots down the middle there, and that gives us that reference, and we get a preview indicating that that's going to show up on the path here. Now I've only got one instance set to a spacing of 80 millimeters, so as I index this up we'll see 80 millimeters, we get another one, but we do see that it moves along that path. All right, so it travels along that path, and if I say OK to that, we see that we get motion, so very much like a path mate, but we get motion in all degrees of freedom. It will rotate, all right, along that circular reference that I gave it, and that circular reference can also move along that path. All right, pretty neat. So this would be used for something like maybe a conveyor system or something like that. Well, as you want to indicate something moving along a conveyor system that has the freedom to move, this would be a perfect application of something like that. Now, if we go back to our chain pattern and make an edit to this, let's move this back to the next type of pattern, which is a linkage, the distance linkage. And if we select this middle option, we see that everything sets up the same, except that we have one more option for reference. So this will allow SOLIDWORKS to change the direction of the components as it moves along this path. So we'll come back and add this here, just using my G key to get in there quickly and back out for the magnifying glass. Magnifying glass, by the way, has been added to the in context menu, so you have quick access to it there as well for 2015. I've left my spacing at 80 millimeters. All right, but we can choose our spacing and we can see that the preview updates accordingly, so it's not based on the length of the component or anything like that. We're just giving it, here's how far apart those components are. and we see that the component is changing direction. All right, so this is different from our first option here in that it will kind of follow its way. It does sort of a backflip there as it goes around, and we can see as we move this, now the component direction changes. So because it now has two bits of reference, it can track here and here on the front and on the back, it will loop that around. All right, so we get a better approximation of a chain, and we see that it does solve very quickly, again because it's a pattern. It's not having to solve all of those contacts or anything like that. It's just a pattern component, so it does solve very quickly. Now the next or last version has the ability to connect those linkages together. So instead of us specifying the spacing, we see that it picks up the spacing that I've defined from those pieces. We have the ability to add another chain group. So if there's a different style component that goes in between there, like a bike chain, we can add multiple components together, which is neat. In this case of an energy chain, it's the same component over and over again. So we'll add a few more of these, and we see how they kind of wrap around there. We'll say OK to that. And now we see a pretty convincing chain system, again, that solves very, very quickly. Pretty cool. Very easy to set up. Now there's one more way that I showed in the rollouts that we can use this, and we'll take a look at that again. So if we set up a mate here between the two of these, between this guy and this guy, just holding my control key again to pull up my mates here, we'll set that. All right, and we'll let that rebuild. And now we see that we've got our chain kind of connected to this base piece. This base piece is fixed in 3D space, so it's just kind of hanging out there. And the last technique that I'll show you for using this is actually letting the sketch move. So if I allow this sketch to float instead of just being fixed here, I've allowed this to move just kind of in plane. And what happens is, if we move this sketch now, we see that this whole thing kind of slides along its path. All right, pretty cool. And again, it solves very, very quickly. So it's fast to set up, it's fast to use, and you can drop this as a subassembly, a flexible subassembly, into a top level and use that with pretty good success. So I think that's an awesome addition for 2015. Definitely one that I've enjoyed playing around with, and easily made my list for this morning's presentation. But we do have some other cool enhancements for assemblies in 2015. So let's pull back up that first assembly rather that we were looking at. One of the mates that they added for this year is a mate that I've been using just constantly since I've loaded 2015, and that's been the profile center mate, which is a really neat one. If we open the mate dialog box here and come down to advanced mates, profile center is the one that's on top. And what that allows us to do is make a couple of selections, and with those couple of selections, it will take the shape, so kind of in all directions, and it will center the two of those. So it does exactly what it sounds. It takes those profiles and it centers the two of them up. Little Birdie has told me this is going to be easier to access in coming releases, so I'm really excited about that. It's very easy to use. Obviously, we make a couple selections and we let SOLIDWORKS do the rest. So it's kind of like a width mate in multiple directions, but we have the opportunity to switch the orientation, which is cool. So it's very flexible in getting what you're after there. If it is a round component, you have the option to lock rotation. So if we used it for something like applying hardware, definitely a cool use for it. Actually, in fact, if we use edges, we can do that. So those will pick up with a profile center. So you can see we kind of get that coincident, that kind of like a peg and hole with a profile center, which is neat. And again, the lock rotation. So this brings to the table a whole nother side of efficiency with just this one mate. Now we can fully define a piece of hardware. So we've got now a mate that's holding that in place. It's in the correct place with one mate, and it's holding it from rotating. So that is great, not just for ease of use, but definitely for assembly performance. Reducing top level mates is very important. So That's been a mate that I've been just using constantly since that's come out. One of the changes that they made as far as working with mates is definitely a nice one. And again, in the rollouts, this is one that I saw that I got a lot of reaction from for good reason. And this is one where if we need to make a change to a component, and I've got this instance here where I have a new bore that needs to be cut. The bore is not the right size, right? So if we shave this out a little bit, very easy to do in SOLIDWORKS. Unfortunately, what the problem becomes is that when that gets updated, we see that unfortunately it breaks some of these mates that we have in place because I've cut away the face that was being used to generate that mate. Now we can always edit mates very easily. If we click on them, we go to edit mate and we see what the problem was. That face that was in there I removed. So we can repoint it with no problem. We can say okay, but in 2015 they added the ability for this to be applied wherever that face is being used. So you can see it's come up and it said there's other mates that we found that are related to this. Do you want to replace them? And once we say yes, what that does is replace all of those other mates that had anything to do with that face. So it kind of globally replaces those mate references, which is amazing, saving a ton of work in scenarios like that. So definitely one of my favorites showing up there. There's been a ton of other assembly changes that they've made this year. The radial explode is really awesome. But I'm going to skip over and move along to some drawing enhancements before we get too long, in case you guys have any questions. So I'm going to hop over to drawings and see what we have here. All right, so just have a sample drawing here. I have my drawing zones turned on, which is one of the enhancements that I think is really cool. So we can visually see where those drawing zones are now. We can turn these on and off. What's even neater is that these drawing zones are actually they're usable. So let's talk about the visibility of them real quick, and then we'll take a look at how to use them. To turn these on and off is under the view drop down. So we see that zone lines is one of the options here. We can toggle that on and off. For whatever reason, I find this hard to remember where this is. I don't know why, but don't forget that you can always use search commands to find these things. So something stuck in your mind that you've seen us show you at some point, don't forget that you can always search for these things, zone lines, and hit your little glasses there. My hand's off the mouse now, but it's telling me where those are, so it gives me a little arrow pointing where they are. So if you ever lose any of these tools or forget where they are, things that don't show up by default on the toolbars, don't forget that you can take a guess at what their names are, and many times you can find them. Zone lines, we'll turn those back on as we're working. We do have the ability to use those, as I've mentioned. If we insert an annotation here, we can use, now it's called a location label. So this just tells us where something is on the sheet. So if we insert a location label, say on, I'll just hit this, this detail view here. We'll say okay, and we'll zoom into this, and this says, okay, this detail is listed in block B1, and if we zoom out, we can see, yep, sure enough, we've got B1. This block is where that detail view resides. So we can easily find things, and the nice thing is that these will they will update. So if things do move, we don't have to track all of these changes manually. So we see that I moved this up a block, and now we see that this callout is listing this for C2. So we can now still find this very easily. Now on a small drawing, this might not make a big difference, but once you get into those bigger sheets, this is very handy and something that you don't have to worry about tracking. As soon as you put that that label in there, that location label in there, it's remembering all that for you, and it'll find where they are on the sheet. Pretty neat. The only other thing that I wanted to talk about with drawings was a zoom to sheet. The zoom to sheet is a new tool. I really like this one as well. All right, we'll take a look for this guy. We have all of our zoom options. I've customized mine a little bit, right? So you can always right click, get your zoom. Zoom to sheet is a neat one because what that does is allows us to zoom to only the sheet instead of a zoom to fit. This can be handy because a lot of times on drawings we've got things that we're just kind of storing off in space. Maybe we have a view that's just kind of over here that we're using as another reference for a detail view or something like that, or we have notes that have moved over, and every time we go to zoom to fit, it zooms to the entire region where we're working, where in reality we're just looking for the sheet itself. So zoom to sheet can be very helpful. I haven't set up a keyboard shortcut for that yet, but it's definitely a good one to customize. And of course you can always drop that in your heads-up display here through customize and get that on your sheet so that you can use that when the need arises. One other thing that I think is cool that just kind of popped into my mind that they changed for drawings this year is with layers. If I right click and find our layers, which is here, we of course always have the ability to change layers, move things around on layers, but this year they've added in a neat functionality where we're able to actually control which layers get printed. So if there are, if we have a layer that is just internal notes or something like that, we can actually turn off the ability for that layer to be printed. Whatever they have, in this example I've got one that's called security that I can turn off. So whatever I have listed on the security layer will not get printed. So if I print a PDF or print that to an actual printer, that information will get omitted from the print, so that it remains internal, or whoever is monitoring that doesn't have to worry about those things getting accidentally released. So I think that's a cool change that they made as well. All right, well, that's a crash course, I guess, of some of my favorite things. Obviously, there are tons and tons of other enhancements for 2015, but those are some of my favorites that I've kind of listed out for you guys. So I think with that, we're getting kind of close on time, so I'm gonna bump back. And if you guys have any questions, then you can let me know. And if not, then we'll see you guys in the next one. So thanks for watching.
Don't forget to check us out on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and our blog for more great content by clicking on the links in the description below.